Welcome back, and thanks for joining us for another episode. We're going to talk today about communicating incident response reports. And I think I mentioned in a previous episode, I'm saying the word communicate a lot in this series. That's going to be a recurring topic.
That's okay, because it really presses the issue that we're here to talk about, and that's the communication. Remember, as a cybersecurity analyst, it's going to be your job to not only to analyze various components of the security posture within your organization, but also to formulate and establish a secure communication plan when it comes to providing the information that is in those incident response reports, right? Very, very important. And as much as we'd like to say that incident response is a nice linear fashion from detection to remediation recovery, however you'd like to say the last step. Sometimes people separate them, sometimes people include them. It's a very small, you will take small iterative steps that'll kind of loop back on themselves. So it is going to be important for you to do a couple of things, to be able to identify the stakeholders that you're communicating with, and really to break down the components of the response report to those stakeholders, and that's what we're going to talk about here in this episode.
We have quite a few stakeholders we're dealing with, right? We've got legal, we've got executive team, IT security, so we got a whole list to go through, right?
It really is, and it is important to be able to identify who those stakeholders are. And very generically speaking, you could say anybody that is not a part of the remediation effort that requires communication. That's a stakeholder. It could be an employee. It could be, like Sophia said, the executives, upper management, right? It could be the IT team. It could be somebody on the outside of your company, maybe a customer that you're responding to because of an SLA violation, because of some incident. So let's go ahead and let's just have a little conversation here about some of the stakeholders. Now, when it comes to the IT security team, you might be part of they call it CSRIT. No, IRT. So the Cybersecurity Incident Response Team. You might be part of just that by yourself, or what's more common in organizations is a single security administrator to wear multiple hats. So do keep that in mind. But the point of the stakeholder here in the conversation is to identify that the security team holds the technical aspects of the response themselves, right? For instance, in that response, they will most likely be the ones, even if it's that cybersecurity incident response team that's just maybe a part of your overall IT staff, that actually has the authority to say that an incident has happened, right? Who can tell you that, yes, this is a security incident, doesn't mean it's a security violation, right? A breach of security is a violation of security policy, right? A security incident, you have to determine, has something actually happened, right? And your IT staff a lot of times is the one that's going to have the authority, right? Communicate the process, right? Who are the names that are in those positions? We have to communicate that ahead of time. We have to know, you'll hear things in incident response. You'll hear things like playbooks, right? When we say playbooks are a really cool way to have a recipe style response to whatever the incident is. Because you have to keep in mind that at the point of the incident is not a time to formulate a plan, especially when things are going wrong, right? We want to have those step-by-step. Just think about it if you're calling in for support, right? How many times have you called the same company, maybe in the same day, got two completely different support specialists, right? And support is important. I'm not talking down to anybody. But even though you got two different support specialists, you got the same 5 to 10 questions because they have a playbook. Now, that's a support playbook. The incident response should be nothing different than that as well. Who handles the response? Again, communicating the names, the positions, the contact information, right? How about incident escalation? I respond to the incident and I realize, wait a second, I don't have the skills to help remediate this. I need to escalate it to Sophia. Now, do we have that process in place? All of that has to be communicated. If I can't take care of this, who do I escalate that? How does it go back up the chain? So that's important to keep in mind too. The next one is the executives, and you heard Sophia kind of mention this ahead of time. Executives, now we can talk all we want about executive summaries and say, hey, executive summaries just highlight and summarize the key points of the findings in the incident report. Technical definition. But in reality, what it comes down to is that your executives there will make the key decisions, and their job is to support you, to provide the resources, to provide the human capital and the time that it takes to respond to these incidences. Your executives will be the one that says, yeah, kill, switch, engage on the server, shut it down. We need to fix it. Or they'll say, don't shut it down. We need a failover plan. We need to fail over to a disaster recovery site, and we'll shut the main site down. You as a cybersecurity analyst, you don't have the authority to call that, but you do have the ability to communicate why that may or may not need to happen.
Right, like you can make suggestions and say, this is what's going on, this is what I think we should do, but they've ultimately got the final say.
That's right. And you'll see later on when we, a little bit in the episode, when we talk about recommendations, what are the suggested controls based on your experience and analysis? And you absolutely have to communicate that. Other things that we have, legality, legal, and this needs to be built into the framework of the policy. And according to being a security analyst, you might make recommendations on this, because if we talk about compliance regulations that maybe you've violated. We've talked about things like, for instance, maybe there's some kind of civil legal requirements, civil or I guess criminal liabilities, right? You need legal counsel. When there's an incident, if nothing else, you need to talk to your lawyers about, from the law standpoint, we need counseling here to know what we need to do. And that is important, right? Your response strategies should always have some way to stay in compliance with your memorandums of understanding, your service level agreements, your regulatory obligations, your customer obligations, right? So you definitely need to get legal involved as well.
Would it also matter, like, this is just a kind of an outside question,
Sure.
but so you hear about like insider threats and that kind of thing, right? So would it be important to like communicate everything appropriately? Because what if you have to take legal action against someone?
That is true. And that's another part of the secure communications. While not in the list, now we're not talking about encrypting your communications. That's secure communications. And it's another part that I'm glad you brought out, because it's identifying the appropriate stakeholders, right? Because what you tell to an executive or what you tell to an HR person might not be the same thing that you reiterate in a user security awareness training program, right? You might have the 30,000-foot overview on that as, hey, why don't we click on those attachments from people that we don't know, right? That conversation that I have at the general employee level might be different, and most likely will be different at that level as well. Other ones too, public relations. Keep in mind, if we have a support service, just from a general support service, standpoint, company reputation, brand reputation, sometimes you can never get it back, right? Once something happens and we have some kind of public relations incident, do we have support service? Do we have customer service SLAs that we need to communicate? So for instance, let me give you an example. Maybe I've got a system heavily reliant on, let's say, Microsoft's Azure platform, right? I have done my due diligence. I have my redundancies. I have geo redundancy, and their service goes offline and it causes me a service outage, and I can no longer provide support for those customers. All right. Well, at that point, this might go back to legal counsel as well. Who do we actually talk to? Is it the cloud, the CSP, the cloud service provider's issue, or is it my issue, right? So we have to have a thoroughly documented ahead of time. And that also leads us to regulatory authorities. Do you have some kind of regulatory authority that you fall under, whether it's HIPAA, whether it's SOC compliance, all the other ones that we talk about, Sarbanes-Oxley, and there's just a ton of them out there, right? If you fall under compliance and there's an incident that happens, you will probably be talking to every one of these. Legal, let's talk to the regulatory agent, and then maybe let's talk public relations after that, if we can, if we can provide some kind of solution.
And what the thing I had mentioned earlier about like insider threats, this next one is law enforcement. Maybe that is where that would be more appropriate.
Absolutely.
You've got to take action against somebody's committed a crime against you.
Yeah, and you mentioned the term, maybe it's appropriate there. Absolutely. It could be appropriate at the top of the list too. And that's one thing that I always want you to remember. In fact, you'll hear one of our other security educators here that reminds me this on almost a daily basis when we're talking about security. It is not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's a one-size-fits-you. And I'm talking about Dan Lowry, right? Mm-hmm. Everything is going to be tailored and crafted to your organization. So what you see here, you could have 5 more things on this list. Mm-hmm. You could have 3, right? So we give you some examples of common stakeholders. Doesn't mean everyone on this list is actually going to be applicable to your company.
You mentioned like executive summary earlier, so that would be part of the incident response itself, right? Your executive summary.
Yes, it would, which is some of the last things that we've got to talk about. So let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and move into the reporting process itself, right? So, Sophia, you mentioned the executive summary. Again, keep in mind that the executive summary is what summarize. I hate putting the definition in the definition, right? It's a high-level overview, right? What you've done is you've distilled down to the key points that the decision makers need to act on, right? If there's no action item, let's try better English. If there isn't any action item, then why do they care, right? Oh, well, we found 50 vulnerabilities that only affect the chair in the lobby. Yeah, and who cares, right? But I do want to know about that one vulnerability that affects the front-end web server that could be used to pivot to the database and destroy all of our data. Yeah. That we care about. And that's why the executive summary is, it's another way, I like to say it's the get to the point summary, right? Tell us what we have to do right now. What are the action items for the key decision makers within the company is very important. The 5 W's, this is something that is brought in here. So let's start with these. It's the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why. I don't know why they didn't say how. I guess it wouldn't be the 5 W's, I guess, right?
Yeah, not as catchy.
No, it's not as catchy. So let's talk about those real quick, right? In the summary, who was the threat actor, right? What type of occurrence happened? What was the threat vector? How did they get in, right? The when. The timestamp of the occurrence is really what that comes down to. Where? What systems, processes, applications, software? What was it? And it could be a physical location as well, but what processes, what systems were affected? And then why? Identify the vulnerability. Why did it happen? Well, it happened because we needed, I don't know, security patch for SVE 43 million.
Right.
Not a valid number, right? But we didn't have that patch.
Yeah.
Well, that's the vulnerability. That's what the threat actor exploited, and that's the why we're in this situation.
Could it also be like maybe there's an issue that, we're not sanitizing our input, that kind of a thing, and that's how they got in?
It absolutely could. So, for instance, that leads right away to like a SQL injection attack, right?
Right, exactly.
Why did it happen? You aren't putting checks and balances on what's allowed to enter your database. Sure.
And then part of that executive summary, kind of like we were talking about earlier, the executives have the final say of what happens, but you can make suggestions on what to do, right?
That's right, because you definitely influence what those decisions are going to be for sure. All right, next up, recommendations. The influence she just talked about. That's right. So you are going to say, hey, here's the results of the output. Here are the controls that we have in place. Here is the, are the compliance regulations and obligations. And let's go ahead and let's do a gap analysis. Let's find out what the ideal state is. Let's find out what our current state is. And then let's find out the recommendations and controls so that we can hit whatever that ideal state might be. Next up, we've kind of talked about legal already. Legal is something that we have to worry about likewise too. Timeline. The other thing with timeline is a complete record, right? When we talk about things like chain of custody, not necessarily, that would be the last part of incident response, because you have to document and you have to make sure that if you're going to set this stuff as evidence, you have to retain it appropriately. But the point is, the timeline is a documented from beginning to end, right? A complete record from detection to remediation or recovery, because again, remediation, if you've patched the vulnerability, doesn't necessarily mean you've recovered your information, right? So there's a subtlety there that I say, that's more of a personal opinion with me. Then after the timeline, the impact, all right? How did it adversely affect you, right? What financial impact did it have? What functional impact? Again, there's there's many different types of impact. Functional impact is you can no longer provide a service to a customer. Or you've got a productivity app that has gone offline and lack of productivity goes against the availability and the CIA triad. You've now run contrary to whatever your security stance is, right? So what is the level of effect that this had on your company?
Was that where, would you mention at all, I know this is just a summary, so maybe you wouldn't get this in depth. Would you mention at all that, like we talked about critical ratings and stuff, like how severe it was?
You can, because that can say, like, we can use our risk matrix score and we can say, hey, this is a high probability and it's a very high impact, then that's probably something that we should address right away.
Okay.
For sure. Then next is going to be the scope. Remember, the scope is how far, what's the reach of this incident? And we also have to think about things like collateral damage too, right? Do you reach out to vendors? Do you have BPAs, business partner agreements? One of the big things that ruins mergers and acquisitions is when a company buys another company. They are reputable, they are in compliance, but who they merge with is no longer compliant. In fact, I attended one webinar where they had 2 M&A lawyers, and they just had example after example after example of mergers and acquisitions, buying a $30 billion company, merging that company, finding out it's in violation, and the company's not even worth $10 million at the end because of the violations. You want to talk about a bad day at the office. So we have to find out the scope too. And remember, the scope, we have to investigate this. You might turn around and find out in your incident response policy you have gotten to the part of containment and eradication, only to find out you've got collateral damage and you need to start the process over again. Yeah. So like I said, we'd like to say that this is a very linear process, but at the end of the day, very rarely is an incident response going to be just that straight linear fashion.
Yeah, absolutely.
So last one on our list is evidence, and I've kind of mentioned that before. Remember that your evidence for your company supporting your investigation and that you did due diligence, you might imply legal hold, it might imply chain of custody, right? A thorough record, documented record of every single person that the evidence has passed through on its way to a court of law. Because remember, if just a single jot, a single punctuation mark changes in any of the information, if you're going to prosecute somebody with some kind of legality, at the end of the day, the defense attorney could say, that's not my information. It doesn't match what you took into your possession. Now what you're presenting in the court of law, they're completely different. And unfortunately, you're gonna lose out. So these are some of the things. And remember that incident response reporting is vitally important to you as a cybersecurity analyst.
Yeah, and it sounds like this is, like you said, it's not one size fits all. So good points to follow, because every executive summary you put together, I would imagine you would have to talk about the impact, the timeline, the evidence, but that will look different for each organization and each incident that happens. So good to know those points that you can refer to, and then all of the different stakeholders that might be affected. So thank you for walking us through all of that, Wes. And thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We'll see you next time.